Deputies, men of the German Reichstag, a year filled with world historic events is drawing to a close. A year of great decisions stands before us. In these grave times, I speak to you, deputies of the Reichstag, as the representatives of the German nation. But beyond this, the whole German folk should take note of this review and of the decisions that the present and the future force on us. After another rejection of my peace proposal by the present British Prime Minister and the clique that supports or controls him, it became clear by the autumn of 1940 that this war, contrary to all reason and necessity, had to be fought to the end with arms. You know me, my party comrades. I have always been against half-hearted or weak decisions. If Providence wished that the German folk could not be spared this fight, then I would be grateful to it for entrusting me with the waging of a historic struggle which will decisively fashion not only our German history for the next 1,000 years, but also the history of Europe, even the history of the entire world. The German folk and its soldiers today fight not only for themselves and their own time, but also for coming generations, even the most distant ones. The Creator entrusted us with a historical revision of unique scope, which we now are obligated to see through. The armistice in the West, which had become possible immediately after the end of fighting in Norway, forced the German leadership first to militarily secure the conquered territories of political, strategic, and economic significance. In this way, the power of resistance of the territories conquered at the time has changed. A belt of bases and fortifications of great proportions stretches from Kirkenes to the Spanish border. Countless airfields have been built. In the north, sometimes they had to be blasted into prehistorical granite. Naval bases were furnished with shelters in such numbers and of such strength that they could not practically be harmed either from the sea or from the air. For their defense, there are more than 1,500 new batteries whose positions had to be reconnoitered, planned, and built. A network of streets and railroads was designed in such a manner that the link between the Spanish border and Petsamo today is secured irrespective of the sea. Engineering and construction battalions of the Navy, the Army, and the Luftwaffe, in connection with the TOT organization, have created installations here that are not inferior to the West Wall in any way. We continue to work persistently on reinforcing them. It is my imperturbable resolve to make this European front unassailable to every enemy. This defensive work, which continued throughout the last winter, was supplemented by an offensive conduct of the war insofar as this was possible, given the seasonal conditions. German surface craft and submarine naval forces continued to wage their constant war of destruction against the British Navy and Merchant Marine and against those in its service. By flying reconnaissance and attacks, the German Luftwaffe lent support to the destruction of enemy tonnage. In countless retaliation attacks, it gave the English a better idea of the lovely war, whose mastermind has been primarily its present Prime Minister. In this struggle, in the middle of last year, Germany received the support above all of its Italian allies. For many months, the weight of a large part of the British power lay on the shoulders of the allied Italian state. Only because of an enormous superiority in heavy tanks, the English succeeded in bringing about a temporary crisis in North Africa. As early as March 24th of last year, a small group of German-Italian units, led by Rommel, started a counterattack. Ajdabiya fell on April 2nd. Benghazi was reached on April 4th. Our common units moved into Darna on April 8th. Tobruk was surrounded on April 11th. Bardia was occupied on April 12th. The accomplishments of the German Africa Corps were all the more outstanding because this theater of war was completely foreign and its climate was unlike the German climate. Just as in Spain once, Germans and Italians again fought the same enemy together, this time in North Africa, while with the blood of German and Italian soldiers, these daring measures again secured the North African front of our two allied countries. A dreadful danger cast its long, ominous shadows on Europe. Bowing to bitter necessity, I decided in the autumn of 1939 at least to attempt the elimination of the acute German-Russian tensions in order to create the prerequisites for a general peace. Psychologically, this was difficult because of the overall attitude of the German Volk and especially the party toward Bolshevism. Technically, however, this was easy because Germany had always had and pursued only economic interests in those areas that England declared were threatened by us and which it assaulted with pacts of assistance. Deputies, men of the German Reichstag, I may remind you that in the early summer and midsummer of 1939, England again offered its assistance to numerous states and countries, claiming that Germany intended to invade them and rob them of their freedom. The German Reich and its government could, with a clear conscience, assure them that these were mere allegations which did not in any way correspond to the truth. In addition, there was the sober military realization that in the event of a war forced on the German folk by British diplomacy, fighting on two fronts would at any rate lead to very heavy sacrifices. Moreover, once the Baltic states, Romania, and others were inclined to accept the British pacts of assistance and thereby showed that they also believed in such a threat, it was not only the right of the German Reich government, but also a duty on its own responsibility to delineate German interests. To the great regret of the German Reich, these countries shortly realized that the only factor that could constitute a strong guarantee against the threat from the East was Germany. They were lost, since their own policy had severed their ties to the German Reich, and since they had entrusted themselves to the assistance of that power whose notorious egotism throughout the centuries has never afforded anyone any assistance, but instead has always asked for the help of others. Nevertheless, the fate of these countries evoked strong sympathy from the German folk. The sentiments that the winter war of the Finns forced on us were a mixture of bitterness and admiration. As a military people, our hearts went out to them in admiration of their heroism and self-sacrifice. We felt bitter because in view of the enemy threatening us in the west and danger in the east, we were unable to help militarily. As soon as it became clear to us that Russia practically derived the right from the delineation of Germany's political spheres of interest to kill off the nations living outside of them, further relations served only as a means to an end and were contrary to reason and sentiment. As early as the year 1940, we realized more and more each month that the plans of the men in the Kremlin aimed at the domination of Europe and thereby its destruction. At a time when Germany had only a few divisions in the area bordering on Russia, I already explained to the nation the concentration of Russian military power in the east. Only a blind man could have failed to see that this concentration was of such unique dimensions that it would have an impact on world history. And this was not to defend something that was not threatened, but to attack something that appeared unable to defend itself. Even if the lightning end of the campaign in the West prevented the ruling powers in Moscow from counting on an immediate exhaustion of the German Reich, it did not destroy their plans. Instead, it merely postponed the date of the attack. They felt that the summer of 1941 was a most opportune moment to strike. A new Mongol invasion would sweep across Europe. At the same time, Mr. Churchill promised a change in the British fight against Germany. Today, he cowardly seeks to deny that in the secret session of the House of Commons in the year 1940, he pointed to the Soviet entry into the war as a crucial factor in the successful continuation and ending of the war. This entry would take place at the latest in the year 1941 and would also enable England to take the offensive. There was a time when Europe was that Greek island into which Nordic tribes penetrated in order to light the flame for the first time that has since slowly but steadily begun to enlighten the world of man. And as these Greeks parried the invasion of the Persian conquerors, they were not only defending their own homeland, which was Greece, but also that idea that today is called Europe. And then Europe moved from Hellas to Rome. Greek spirit and Greek civilization united with Roman thinking and Roman statesmanship. An empire was created which even today is not equaled in significance and fertility, not to mention surpassed. As the Roman legions defended Italy against the African assault of Carthage in 3 difficult wars and finally secured the victory, again it was not Rome that they were fighting for, but the Roman Greek world, the Europe of the day. The next invasion of this new human civilization's native soil issued from the expanses of the East. A dreadful storm of uncivilized hordes poured out of Inner Asia deep into the heart of today's European continent, burning, pillaging, murdering like a true scourge of God. In the battle on the Catalonian field, Romans and Teutons joined together for the first time to defend that civilization in a struggle of unforeseeable significance. Starting with the Greeks, this civilization first cast its spell on the Romans and now finally on the Germanic people. Europe grew. Hellas and Rome developed into the Occident. For many centuries, its defense was the task not only of the Romans, but also in particular of the Germanic people. The term Europe experienced a spatial expansion, the degree to which the Occident, enlightened by Greek civilization and inspired by the mighty heritage of the Roman Empire, expanded its space through Germanic colonization, irrespective of whether a German emperor fended off invasions from the east at the Unstrut or on the Lechfeld, or whether Africa was forced to retreat from Spain in long battles, it was always the struggle of the developing Europe against a profoundly alien surrounding world. While Rome had earned undying merit in the creation and defense of this continent, the Germanic people now took over the defense and protection of a family of nations. Irrespective of how each nation's political designs and ambitions differed and diverged as a whole, this family of nations formed one unit in terms of blood and culture, while its various parts either equaled or complemented one another. And not only did the settlement of other parts of the world start out from this continent, so did a spiritual and cultural fertilization, as any man who is willing to search for the truth instead of denying it is aware. Therefore, England did not cultivate this continent, but splinters of the Germanic people of our continent moved to this island as Anglo-Saxons and Normans, and made possible a development that is certainly unique. And likewise, America did not discover Europe, but the other way around, and everything that America did not get from Europe may seem admirable to a Jewish mixed race. But Europe sees it as a sign of the decline of art and civilized living, as the heritage of Jewish and Negro blood. My deputies, men of the German Reichstag, I have to make these detailed statements because the struggle, which in the first months of this year slowly began to emerge as inevitable, and which primarily the leadership of the German Reich is called on to lead this time, goes far beyond the interests of our own folk and country. It was not Rome that the Greeks once defended against Carthage. It was not the Occident that the Romans and the Germanic people defended against the Huns. It was not Germany that the German emperors defended against the Mongols. It was not Spain that the Spanish heroes defended against Africa. Instead, it was Europe that all of them defended. In the same way today, Germany does not fight for itself, but for the continent that belongs to all. Therefore, it is fortunate that this realization has imprinted itself so profoundly into the subconscious of most European people that either through comments or the flow of volunteers, they participate in this struggle. When the German and Italian armies deployed on April 6th of this year for the attack against Yugoslavia and Greece, it was the prelude to the great struggle in which we are still involved at the present. The revolt which led to the overthrow of the former Prince Regent and his government in Belgrade decided the further course of events in this part of Europe. While England was prominently involved in this putsch, the leading role was played by the Soviet Union. Mr. Stalin believed that he could obtain via a revolutionary movement against our will what I had refused Mr. Molotov on the occasion of his visit to Berlin. Without paying heed to the concluded treaties, the Bolshevik rulers expanded their goals. The Friendship Pact with the new revolutionary regime revealed like lightning the closeness of the danger. What the German Wehrmacht accomplished in this campaign was honored by the German Reichstag on May 4th, 1941. What I was regrettably unable to express at the time was the realization that we were heading at breakneck speed toward a confrontation with a state that did not intervene at the time of the campaign in the Balkans, only because its concentration of troops had not yet been completed and because it had not been able to utilize the airfields because of the thaw which sets in during this season and turns the runways muddy. My deputies, men of the German Reichstag, as soon as I became aware in the year 1940, through information received from the English House of Commons and observations of Russian troop movements along our borders, that there was the possibility of a danger developing to the east of the Reich, I immediately ordered the activation of numerous new panzer, motorized, and infantry divisions. The prerequisites for this were amply fulfilled as regards both personnel and materiel. I can assure you, my deputies, and the entire German folk of one thing: even if they do understandably talk about armament a lot in the democracies, we nevertheless work far more in National Socialist Germany. It was this way in the past, and it is no different today. Every year will find us with more, and above all, with improved weapons where decisions are made. In spite of seeing the necessity of under no circumstances offering the enemy the possibility of delivering the first strike at our heart, the decision was nonetheless very difficult in this case. If the authors of articles in our democratic newspapers today claim that, realizing the strength of the Bolshevik enemy, I decided to attack, then they misjudge both the situation and my mind. I was not looking for a war. On the contrary, I did everything to avoid it. However, I would have been derelict in my duties and irresponsible had I failed to act on the possible consequences in spite of realizing the inevitability of the clash of arms. Since I regarded the Soviet Union as a deadly danger not only to the German Reich, but also to all of Europe, I was determined, if possible, to give the sign to attack a few days before this confrontation broke out. Today, we have truly crushing and authentic material to prove that Russia intended to attack. Likewise, we are aware of the time chosen for the attack. In view of the great danger, the full extent of which we realize perhaps only today, I can only thank the Lord for enlightening me at the right moment and giving me the strength to do what had to be done. Not only millions of German soldiers owe their life to him, but so does all of Europe. Because I can say this today, had this wave of more than 20,000 Soviet tanks, hundreds of divisions, tens of thousands of guns, accompanied by more than 10,000 planes, unexpectedly started to move across the Reich, then Europe would have been lost. Fate has chosen a number of nations to risk their blood in order to prevent this blow, or rather to parry it. Had Finland not been immediately determined to take up arms a second time, then the easy middle-class way of life in the other Nordic states would quickly have come to an end. Had the German Reich not confronted this enemy with its soldiers and arms, then a wave would have swept over Europe that would have taken care of the ridiculous British idea of the balance of power in Europe in all its banality and stupid tradition. Once and for all, had not Slovaks, Hungarians, and Romanians also taken on the defense of this European world, then the Bolshevik hordes, like Attila's gangs of Huns, would have roared across the Danubian lands, and then today Tartars and Mongols would stand at the Ionian Sea, forcing a revision of the Treaty of Montreux. Had not Italy, Spain, and Croatia sent their divisions, then the resistance of the European front would not have developed, which, as the proclamation of a new Europe, has won over all other nations. With this anticipation, they came as volunteers from Northern and Western Europe, Norwegians, Danes, Dutch, Flemish, Belgians, even Frenchmen. They gave the struggle of the powers allied to the Axis the character of a European crusade, in the true sense of the word. It is not yet the right time to speak about the planning and conduct of this campaign. Alas, I believe that I can now already point out in a few sentences what has been accomplished in this mightiest struggle of all time, in which the impressions are all too often blurry and fade in our memories because of the vastness of the space and the multitude and power of the events. On June 22nd, the attack began at daybreak. With irresistible daring, the border fortifications were broken down, fortifications which had been intended to protect against surprise from the Russian concentration against us. Grodno fell as early as June 22nd. After the conquest of Brest-Litovsk on June 23rd, the citadel was overwhelmed and Vilnius and Kaunas were taken. On June 26th, Daugavpils fell. On July 10th, the first two great battles of encirclement at Belostok and Minsk were concluded. A total of 324,000 prisoners, 3,332 tanks, 1,809 guns fell into our hands. By July 13th, there already was a breakthrough at almost all the decisive points of the Stalin line. On July 16th, Smolensk fell after heavy fighting, while on July 19th, German and Romanian units forced the crossing of the Dniester. On August 6th, the Battle of Smolensk ended in many pockets. Again, 310,000 Russians marched into German captivity, while 3,205 tanks and 3,120 guns were partly destroyed, partly taken as booty, and 3 days later, a further Russian army group met its fate. On August 9th, 103,000 Soviets were taken prisoner in the Battle of Uman. 317 tanks and 1,100 guns were either destroyed or captured. On August 15th, Nikolaev fell. On the 21st, Kherson was taken. On the same day, the battle near Gomel ended. 84,000 prisoners, 144 tanks, and 848 guns were captured or destroyed. On August 21st, Russian positions between the Ilmen and Chutskoye lakes were broken up, while on August 26th, the bridgehead across the Dnieper around Dnipropetrovsk fell into our hands. On the 28th of the same month, German troops moved into Reval and Baltic Port after heavy fighting, while the Finns took Vyborg on August 30th. With the conquest of Schlüsselburg on September 8th, Petersburg was also sealed off to the south for good. On September 16th, we succeeded in establishing bridgeheads across the Dnieper. As early as September 18th, Poltava fell into the hands of our soldiers. On September 19th, German units stormed the citadel of Kiev. And on September 22nd, the conquest of Osul was crowned by the taking of the capital. It was only now that the bigger operations began to bear fruit in unexpected successes. On September 27th, the battle at Kiev was concluded. 665,000 prisoners began to move westward in endless columns. 884 tanks and 3,178 guns remained behind in the pockets as booty. As early as October 2nd, a breakthrough battle began at the center of the Eastern Front, while on October 11th, the battle at the Sea of Azov ended in victory. Again, 107,000 prisoners, 212 tanks, and 672 guns were counted. On October 16th, after a hard battle, German and Romanian units entered Odessa. On October 18th, the breakthrough battle at the center of the front, which had begun on October 2nd, ended in a new success, unique in world history. The result was 663,000 prisoners, 1,242 tanks, and 5,452 guns destroyed or captured. On October 21st, the conquest of Dago was completed. On October 24th, the industrial center Kharkov was taken. On October 28th, after hard fighting, a gateway to the Crimea was forced open. As early as November 2nd, the capital Simferopol was stormed. On November 16th, the Crimean Peninsula was cut through at Kirk. On December the 1st, the total number of captured Soviets stood at 3,806,865. The number of destroyed or captured tanks was 21,391, the number of guns 32,541, and the number of planes 14,322. In the same period, 2,191 British planes were downed. The Navy sank 4,170,611 GRT, while the Luftwaffe sank 2,346,180 GRT. Altogether, 6,516,791 GRT were destroyed. My deputies, my German folk, these are sober facts and perhaps dry figures. May they never fade from the history and, above all, from the conscience and memory of our own German Volk. For behind these figures are hidden the accomplishments, the sacrifices, the privations, the heroism, and the readiness to die of millions of the best men of our own Volk and of the Allied States. All this had to be fought for at the risk of life and limb, and with efforts of which the homeland has hardly any idea. Marching endless distances, tortured by heat and thirst, often driven to despair by muddy roads, at the mercy of the rigors of the climate, from the White to the Black Sea, from the scorching heat of the days of July and August to the winter storms of November and December, tormented by insects, suffering from the dirt and the bugs, freezing in the snow and ice. That is how the Germans fought, and the Finns, the Italians, the Slovaks, the Hungarians and Romanians, the Croats, the volunteers from the northern and western European countries, all the soldiers of the Eastern Front. I do not want to name any branch of the service today. I do not want to praise any leader. They all gave their best, and yet insight and justice compel me to state one thing. Of all our German soldiers, our unique infantry bears the greatest burden of the battle in this struggle, today as well as in former times. From June 22nd to December 1st, the German army lost in this heroic struggle 158,773 dead, 563,082 wounded, and 31,191 missing in action. The Luftwaffe, 3,231 dead, 8,453 wounded, and 2,028 missing in action. The Navy, 310 dead, 232 wounded, and 115 missing in action. Therefore, the Wehrmacht together had 162,314 dead, 571,767 wounded, and 33,334 missing in action. That is a little more than twice the number of dead and wounded in the Battle of the Somme in the World War, and a little less than half the number of missing at the time, and yet they are the fathers and sons of our German folk. And now let me make my case before the outside world, which is represented by a man who, while other nations and soldiers are fighting in the snow and ice, tactfully chats by the fireside and therefore is the principal in this war. When, in the year 1939, the situation of the nationalities in the former Polish state seemed to become increasingly unbearable, I first attempted to eliminate the intolerable circumstances by means of a fair settlement. For some time, it appeared as though the Polish government itself was seriously considering accepting a reasonable solution. I may add here that all these proposals contained no demands by Germany for anything that had not formerly been in Germany's possession. On the contrary, we renounced many things that had belonged to Germany before the World War. You will remember the dramatic events of this time, the persistently increasing sacrifices by the German ethnic group. My deputies, You are in the best position to judge the severity of this sacrifice of blood by comparing it to the sacrifices of the present war. For the campaign in the East up to now has cost the entire German Wehrmacht about 160,000 dead, while in the midst of peace, over 62,000 ethnic Germans were killed within a few months at the time, some of them killed after the cruelest tortures. That the German Reich had the right to complain about this state of affairs at its border and to urge its elimination, and in general to attend to its security, can hardly be denied at a time when other countries seek elements of their security even on foreign continents. The problems that were to be corrected were insignificant in terms of territory. Essentially, it was a question of Danzig and connecting the severed province East Prussia to the rest of the Reich. By contrast, the cruel persecution of the Germans, especially in Poland, weighed heavier. The other minorities there also endured a no less terrible fate, as the attitude of Poland became ever more stubborn during the days of August. Thanks to the carte blanche provided by the English guarantee, the German Reich government felt compelled, for the last time, to make proposals based on which it was willing to enter into negotiations with Poland, and of which it orally informed the English ambassador at the time. Allow me to retrieve these proposals from oblivion today and to remind you of them. Meanwhile, insight into the papers at the Foreign Office in Warsaw later provided all of us with a surprising explanation. A man with devilish recklessness employed his entire influence in order to strengthen Poland in its resistance and to eliminate any possibility of an understanding. The reports that the Polish envoy in Washington at the time, Count Potocki, sent his government in Warsaw are documents that make frightfully clear how much a single man and the forces driving him bear responsibility for the Second World War. The question poses itself: for what reason was this man so fanatically hostile toward a country that up to now has never in its history harmed either America or this man? Insofar as this regards Germany's attitude to America, the following can be said. 1. Germany is perhaps the only great power that has never possessed colonies on the North and South American continents, or has become politically active there in any other respect, with the exception of the emigration of millions of Germans and their work, from which the American continent, especially the United States, has only benefited. 2. The German Reich has never in the entire history of the development and existence of the United States assumed a politically adverse or even hostile attitude to it. On the contrary, through the blood of many of its sons, it has helped to defend the United States. 3. The German Reich has never participated in a war against the United States, while in the year 1917 it was invaded by the United States for reasons that have been revealed completely by a committee that the current President Roosevelt had himself formed in order to examine this question. It was this investigative committee for the examination of the reasons behind the American entry into the war that clearly stated that the American entry into the war in 1917 was due to the capitalist interests of a few small groups, and that Germany had no intention of coming into conflict with America. Beyond this, there is likewise no antagonism between the German and the American people, either territorial or political in nature, that could somehow interfere with the interests or the existence of the United States. There has always been a difference in the form of government. However, this cannot be regarded as the cause of animosity in the life of nations, as long as one form of government does not try, outside its natural sphere, to intervene in others. America is a republic led by a president with great authoritarian powers. Germany was once a monarchy with limited authority, later a democracy without any authority at all, and today it is a republic with great authority. There is an ocean between the two states. The differences between capitalist America and Bolshevik Russia, if there is any truth to these terms at all, must be considerably greater than the differences between an America led by a president and a Germany led by a Führer. However, it is a fact that the two historic conflicts between Germany and the United States, while inspired by the same force, were fanned by two men in the United States of America, namely President Wilson and President Franklin Roosevelt. History itself passed a verdict on Wilson. His name remains tied to the vilest breach of promise of all time. The consequences of this breach of promise disrupted the life not only of the vanquished, but also of the victors. The Diktat of Versailles, which was made possible only by this breach of promise, tore states apart, destroyed cultures, and ruined the economy. Today, we know that an association of interested financiers stood behind Wilson. They used the paralytic professor in order to lead America into a war which they hoped would be good business for them. The German Volk had to pay for that with the collapse of its political and economic life. For what reason is it that, after these bitter experiences, another president of the United States sees as his only mission allowing wars to develop and, above all, increasing the animosity against Germany to the point of war breaking out? National Socialism came to power in Germany in the same year in which Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. It is now important to examine those elements that have to be regarded as the cause of the present development. First, the personal aspects. I understand only too well that the philosophy of life and the attitude of President Roosevelt and my own are worlds apart. Roosevelt comes from a family rolling in money. From the start, he belonged to that class of men for whom birth and descent paved the way and secure success in life in the democracies. I myself was the child of a small poor family. With unspeakable effort, I had to make my way through work and diligence. When the World War came, Roosevelt experienced it from where he was in the shadow of Wilson, from the point of view of the profiteer. Therefore, he only knows the pleasant consequences of the confrontation of people and states reserved for the man who makes deals where others bleed to death. During this time, I lived my own life on the other, completely opposite side. I did not belong to the men who make history or deals. I belonged to those who followed orders. As a common soldier, I labored to do my duty in front of the enemy during these 4 years. I returned from the war just as poor as I had left for it in the autumn of 1914. I shared the fate of millions of others. Mr. Roosevelt shared the fate of the so-called upper 10,000. While after the war, Mr. Roosevelt tried his hand at financial speculations in order to benefit personally from the inflation, that is, the diligence of others, I was still lying in the military hospital like hundreds of thousands of other men. And while Mr. Roosevelt finally set out to pursue the career of a normal politician who is experienced in business, has economic backing, and is protected by his birth, I fought as a nameless and unknown man for the resurrection of my Volk, a people which had just suffered the greatest injustice in its history, the course of the two lives. When Franklin Roosevelt became the head of the United States, he was the candidate of a thoroughly capitalist party which used him. When I became the Chancellor of the German Reich, I was the Führer of a popular movement which I myself had created. The forces that drove Mr. Roosevelt were forces that I fought for the fate of my folk and my sacred inner beliefs. The brain trust that the new American president had to rely on consisted of members of the same people that we once fought in Germany as a parasitic phenomenon of mankind and which we had begun to remove from public life. But still, we had something in common. Franklin Roosevelt took over a state with an economy dilapidated due to democratic influences, and I headed a Reich likewise facing complete ruin thanks to democracy. The United States had 13 million unemployed, while Germany had 7 million, along with another 7 million part-time workers. In both states, public finances were in ruins, and the decline of economic life in general appeared inevitable. At this moment, a development set in the United States and in the German Reich that will make it easy for posterity to pass a final judgment on the correctness of the theories. While the German Reich, under its National Socialist leadership, experienced an enormous improvement of life within a few years. As regards the economy, culture, art, and so on, President Roosevelt did not manage to bring about even the smallest improvements in his own country. However, how much easier must this work have been in the United States, where barely 15 persons live on 1 square kilometer compared to the 140 in Germany? If it was not possible to bring about a flourishing of the economy in this country, then this was either due to the lack of will on the part of the ruling leadership or the total incompetence of the responsible persons. Within barely 5 years, the economic problems in Germany were solved and unemployment eliminated. During this time, President Roosevelt increased the national debt of his country to enormous proportions, devalued the dollar, continued to ruin the economy, and maintained unemployment. That was not surprising if you consider that the spirits which this man had called on to support him, or rather, who had called on him, belonged to those elements which, as Jews, always have an interest in ruin and never in order. While we fought speculation in National Socialist Germany, it experienced an astounding boom during the Roosevelt era. The New Deal legislation of this man was wrong. Therefore, it was the greatest setback that a single man ever suffered. There is no doubt that in peacetime, A continuation of this economic policy would have meant the fall of this president sooner or later, in spite of his dialectical talents. In European states, he would surely have met his end before the Supreme Court because of the willful waste of national wealth. In front of a civil court, he would hardly have escaped being found guilty of bad business practices, and he would have ended up in jail. Many distinguished Americans agree with this assessment, or rather, realization. A threatening opposition hangs over the head of this man. It made him realize that only a diversion of the public's attention from domestic to foreign policy could save him. In this respect, it is interesting to study the reports from Washington by the Polish envoy Potocki. He points out time and again that Roosevelt was quite aware of the danger of a collapse of his entire economic house of cards, and that, in any event, he therefore needed a foreign policy diversion. He was reinforced in this by the circle of Jews surrounding him, steeped in the greed of the Old Testament, who saw the United States as an instrument for preparing a second Purim for the increasingly anti-Semitic European nations. It was the sheer satanic malice of the Jews who gathered about this man, but for whom this man also reached out. And so the influence of the president increasingly became felt in the creation of new conflicts and in the deepening of existing conflicts, and, in any case, in the prevention of the peaceful resolution of conflicts. For many years, this man has had only one wish: that a dispute might arise somewhere in the world, in Europe, if possible, which would allow him to bring about an intertwinement of political interests based on the obligations of the American economy to one of the disputants, and which would be suited to drawing America slowly into such a conflict. In this way, he might be able to divert attention from his confused economic policy at home to events abroad. This made his procedure against the German Reich become especially brusque. From the year 1937 on, there has been a series of speeches, among them an especially vile one in Chicago on October 5th, 1937, in which, according to plan, this man began to agitate the American public against Germany. He threatened the establishment of a type of quarantine against the so-called authoritarian states. In the course of this continuously augmented campaign of hatred and agitation by President Roosevelt, he recalled the American ambassador in Berlin to Washington, following renewed insulting declarations. Ever since, both states have been represented only by a charge d'affaires. From November 1938 on, he consciously began to sabotage, according to plan, all possibilities for a policy of European pacification. Externally, he hypocritically pretended to have an interest in peace, while threatening every state ready to pursue a policy of peaceful settlement with the freezing of loans, other economic acts of retaliation, the cancellation of credits, and so on. Here, the reports of the Polish ambassadors in Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels give shocking insights. In January 1939, this man began to reinforce his campaign of hatred. In front of Congress, he threatened to take all steps short of war against the authoritarian states. While he always maintains that other states are seeking to interfere in American affairs and insists on adherence to the Monroe Doctrine, he began from March 1939 on meddling in intra-European affairs which are none of the business of the President of the United States. First, he does not understand these problems. Second, even if he understood them and the historical course of events, he would likewise have no right to concern himself with the Central European area, just as the German head of state has no right to judge the situation in a state of the United States of America or to comment on it. Yes, Mr. Roosevelt went further still. Contrary to all the provisions of international law, he declared that he would not recognize governments that were not to his liking, that he would not accept any new order, would not dismiss missions from long-dissolved states, which he instead put in place as legal regimes. Finally, he went so far as to conclude treaties with such envoys, which gave him the right to occupy foreign territories. This was followed on April 15, 1939, by Roosevelt's famous appeal to me and the deuce. It represented a mixture of political and geographic ignorance on the one hand, coupled with the arrogance of a member of certain circles of millionaires on the other. It demanded that we give declarations and conclude treaties of non-aggression with any named states, to a great extent states that were not free because the allies of Mr. Roosevelt had either annexed them or transformed them into protectorates. You remember, my deputies, that I gave this impertinent gentleman a response that was as polite as it was definite, and which stopped the torrent of words from this worthy warmonger for a few months at least. He was replaced by his dear wife. She did not want to live with her sons in a world like the one we have today. Understandably so, because this is a world of work and not a world of fraud and manipulation. After a short convalescence, The husband of this woman got an amendment of the law on neutrality passed on November 4th, 1939, which lifted the ban on weapon export and led to a unilateral supply of arms to Germany's enemies. As in East Asia with China, he then began by means of an economic net to establish a community of interests which would become effective sooner or later. In the same month, he recognized a bunch of Polish emigrants as the so-called government in exile, whose political foundation consisted in a few million Polish gold coins that they had brought from Warsaw. On April 9th, the story continues. He ordered the freezing of Norwegian and Danish funds under the mendacious pretext of preventing German access to them, although he knew that, for example, Germany does not pay attention to the Danish government's administration of property, not to mention control it. In addition to the various governments in exile, the Norwegian one received recognition too. As early as May 15th, 1940, the Dutch and the Belgian émigré governments were added to this. Likewise, Dutch and Belgian funds were frozen. The true sentiments of this man were revealed in a telegram to the French Premier Reynaud on June 15th. He informed him that the American government would double its assistance to France, provided that France continued the war against Germany. In order to emphasize this desire for a prolongation of the war, he declared that the American government would not recognize the results of the conquest, that is, the reclaiming of the areas Germany was once robbed of. I need not assure you that it does not matter to any German government whether the President of the United States recognizes a border in Europe or not, and that it will not matter in the future either. I cite this case only to make clear the nature of this man's planned campaign to simulate peace while eternally agitating for war, because now he begins to fear that if peace is achieved in Europe, the millions wasted on his armament will shortly be recognized as pure fraud, for nobody will attack America unless the Americans provoke the attack. On June 17th, 1940, the President of the United States decreed French funds frozen in order, as he put it, to prevent German access to them. In fact, with the help of an American cruiser, the gold was removed from Casablanca to America. From July 1940 on, Roosevelt's measures increasingly aimed for war, ranging from American citizens joining the Royal Air Force to English crews being trained in the United States. And in August 1940, the United States and Canada established a military program together in order to make the formation of an American-Canadian Committee for Defense appear plausible to even the biggest blockheads. He invented a crisis from time to time. Then he acted as though America were threatened by an attack, and he got his followers, they are truly pitiful, to believe this by interrupting his travels and rushing back to Washington in order to underline the gravity of the situation. In September 1940, he drew still closer to war. He transferred 50 destroyers from the American fleet to the English fleet, in return for which, however, he took over military bases in the British possessions in Northern and Central America. Only posterity will be able to determine one thing clearly, whether he, along with all this hatred against socialist Germany, intended to take over the British Empire in its hour of disintegration as safely and with as few risks as possible. Now that England was no longer able to pay cash for American deliveries, he forced the Lend-Lease Act on the American people. As the president, he now had the power to lend and lease in support of those countries whose defense appeared to him, Roosevelt, to be vital to the defense of America. Again, in March 1940, since Germany could not be moved under any circumstances to react to his persistent insults, he went yet a step further. As early as December 19, 1939, American cruisers inside the security zone drove the German steamer Columbus into the hands of British warships. Because of this, it had to be scuttled. On the same day, United States forces played a part in the attempt to capture the German steamer Arauca. On January 27, 1940, the United States cruiser Trenton informed enemy naval forces, in violation of international law, of the movements of the German merchant steamers Arauca, La Plata, and Wangoni. On June 27, 1940, again in complete violation of international law, he ordered a restriction of the freedom of movement of foreign merchant ships in American ports. In November 1940, he had the German steamers Phrygia, Darwald, and Rhine pursued by United States warships until these steamers were scuttled to avoid falling into the enemy's hands. On April 13, 1941, the opening of the Red Sea to traffic followed, which enabled United States ships to supply British armies in the Near East. In the meantime, American public authorities had confiscated German ships in the month of March. Citizens of the German Reich were treated in a disgraceful manner, and in violation of international law, certain places of residence were assigned to them, travel restrictions imposed on them, and so on. Likewise, in violation of all stipulations of international law, 2 German officers who had escaped Canadian captivity were arrested and extradited to Canada. On March 27th, the same president, who is opposed to all aggression, welcomed that clique of putschists under Simovic and his comrades who usurped power through aggression in Belgrade by overthrowing the legitimate government. Many months before, this President Roosevelt had sent Colonel Donovan, a completely inferior individual, to the Balkans to attempt on his behalf to bring about a rebellion in Sofia and Belgrade directed against Germany and Italy. In April, he promised assistance based on the Lend-Lease Act to Yugoslavia and Greece. In late April, this man recognized Yugoslav and Greek emigrants as governments in exile, and again, in violation of international law, he froze Yugoslav and Greek funds. From mid-April on, surveillance of the Western Atlantic was extended to include United States patrols and reports to the English. On April 26th, Roosevelt delivered 20 motor torpedo boats, and at the same time, repair work on British warships continued in United States ports. On May 12th, in violation of international law, Norwegian steamers sailing under English flag were armed and repaired. On June 4th, American troop carriers arrived in Greenland for the construction of airfields. On June 9th, there was a first English report that, on the orders of President Roosevelt, a United States warship had fired depth charges at a German U-boat off Greenland. On June 14th, again in violation of international law, German funds in the United States were frozen. On June 17th, under mendacious pretexts, President Roosevelt demanded the recall of German consuls and the closing of German consulates. He further demanded the shutting down of the German press agency Transocean, the German Library of Information, and the German Reichsbahn Center. From July 6th to 7th, on the orders of Roosevelt, American forces occupied Iceland, which lay inside the German combat zone. Thereby, he hoped for certain results. 1, to force war on Germany. 2, to render German submarine warfare as useless as it had been in the years 1915 to 1916. At the same time, he sent an American promise of assistance to the Soviet Union. On July 10th, Secretary of the Navy Knox suddenly announced that the United States had orders to fire on the Axis powers. On September 4th, based on this order and together with English planes, the United States destroyer Greer operated against German submarines in the Atlantic. 5 days later, a German submarine noticed United States destroyers serving as escort vessels in an English convoy. On September 11th, Roosevelt finally delivered the speech in which he confirmed and reissued the order to fire on ships of the Axis. On September 29th, the United States Coast Guard attacked a German U-boat east of Greenland with depth charges. On October 17th, the United States destroyer Kearney, in convoy for England, again attacked a German submarine with depth charges. Finally, on November 6th, in violation of international law, United States forces captured the German steamer Odenwald, towed it into an American harbor, and arrested the crew. I shall pass over as trivial the insulting attacks and affronts by this so-called president against my person. That he calls me a gangster is of all the less consequence, as this term did not originate in Europe, perhaps because it lacks appropriate subjects here, but instead originated in the United States of America. Apart from this, I cannot be insulted by Mr. Roosevelt, because I think that he is mentally ill, just as I thought Woodrow Wilson once was. We are aware that this man and his Jewish following fight Japan by the same means. I do not need to discuss them here. Here, too, the same methods were employed. First, this man agitates for war, then falsifies the causes, makes arbitrary declarations, later disgustingly hides behind a cloud of Christian hypocrisy. Slowly but surely, he leads mankind toward war. As an old Freemason, he cannot do so without calling God as a witness for the integrity of his actions. I think that all of you felt relieved that now finally one state has protested as the first against this historically unique and brazen abuse of truth and law. This man asked for it, and therefore he should not be surprised by it. It fills all of us, the German folk, and I think all decent people of the world, with profound satisfaction that the Japanese government, after negotiating with this falsifier for years, has finally had enough of being derided in so dishonorable a manner. We know what force stands behind Roosevelt. It is the eternal Jew. He thinks that the time has come to force on us something that made us shudder in the Soviet Union. We know the Jewish paradise on earth. Millions of German soldiers gained personal insights into a country where this international Jew has destroyed man and property. Perhaps the President of the United States himself has failed to understand this. This speaks for his mental limitations. But we know what the goal of his struggle is. Even if we were not allied to Japan, we would realize that it is the intention of the Jews and their Franklin Roosevelt to destroy one state after another. Today's German Reich has, however, nothing in common with the former Germany. For our part, we shall now do what this troublemaker has tried to get us to do for years, not only because we are Japan's ally, but also because the present leaders of Germany and Italy understand that in this historic time, the existence or non-existence of nations is being determined perhaps forever. It is clear to us what this other world plans to do with us. They made the former democratic Germany starve, and they would exterminate the National Socialist Germany of today. If Mr. Churchill or Mr. Roosevelt now declare that they wish to establish a new social order later, then this is tantamount to a bald hairdresser recommending his unfailing hair restorer. These gentlemen who live in socially retarded states should have taken care of their unemployed instead of agitating for war. There is enough need and misery in their countries to keep them occupied with the distribution of foodstuffs. As far as the German Volk is concerned, it does not want handouts from Mr. Churchill or Mr. Roosevelt. It wants its rights, and it will secure these rights to life even if 1,000 Churchills conspire against it. This Volk has a history of nearly 2,000 years. Thanks to the National Socialist movement, it has never been as united and unified as it is today and as it will be in the future. Perhaps never before has it been so clear-sighted and rarely so aware of its honor. I have therefore had passports sent to the American charge d'affaires and had the following announced to him. In the pursuit of the continuous expansion of the policy by President Roosevelt to establish a dictatorship of unlimited world rule, the United States of America, together with England, has not shied away from employing every means to dispute the foundations for the natural preservation of the German, the Italian, and the Japanese people's life. Because of this, the governments of England and of the United States of America have opposed any justified revision to bring about a better new world order, not only for the present, but also for the future. Since the beginning of the war, the American President Roosevelt has committed more and more crimes against international law. Lawless attacks on ships and other property of German and Italian citizens have been accompanied by threats to, yes, and even arbitrary deprivation of their personal liberty by means of internment, and so on. The attacks by President Roosevelt of the United States have escalated in other respects as well, and have led him to order the Navy, contrary to the rules of international law, to attack immediately ships of German and Italian nationality, to fire on them, and to sink them. American cabinet secretaries have participated in this in a criminal manner by destroying German U-boats through their campaigns of agitation. German and Italian merchant ships have been attacked by American cruisers, captured, and their peaceable crews imprisoned. Furthermore, without any effort by the American government to deny it publicly, a plan by President Roosevelt was published in America indicating that he wanted to attack Germany and Italy in Europe by military means, at the latest in the year 1943. Because of this, Germany and Italy's sincere and patient efforts to prevent an expansion of the war and to maintain relations with the United States in spite of the unbearable provocations by President Roosevelt over the years have been frustrated. In response to this, Germany and Italy have finally felt obliged to fight together side by side with Japan against the United States and England, true to the stipulations of the Tripartite Pact of September 27, 1940, in the struggle for the defense and thereby the preservation of the freedom and independence of their people and empires. The three powers have therefore concluded the following agreement, which was signed today in Berlin. In the unshakable determination not to lay down their arms until the common war against the United States of America and England has been brought to a victorious end, the German, the Italian, and the Japanese governments have agreed on the following. Article 1, Germany, Italy, and Japan will together fight this war a war that was forced on them by the United States of America and England, and bring it to a victorious end by deploying all instruments of power at their disposal. Article 2, Germany, Italy, and Japan pledge themselves not to conclude a separate armistice or peace with the United States of America and England without obtaining full mutual consent. Article the 3rd, Germany, Italy, and Japan will continue to cooperate closely even after the victorious conclusion of the war as a sign of bringing about a just new order in the spirit of the Tripartite Pact concluded on September 27, 1940. Article 4. This agreement comes into force upon signature. It will remain in force for the term of the Tripartite Pact of September 27, 1940. The high contracting parties shall reach an understanding on the nature of the cooperation provided for in Article 3 of this agreement in a timely fashion prior to the expiration of this term. Deputies, men of the German Reichstag, ever since the rejection of my last peace proposal in July 1940, we have been aware that this war has to be fought to the bitter end. That the Anglo-American Jewish capitalist world formed a front with Bolshevism does not come as a surprise to us National Socialists. At home, we found them in the same union, and we succeeded in our struggle at home by defeating our enemies after a 16-year-long struggle for power. When I decided 23 years ago to enter politics in order to reverse the decline of the nation, I was a nameless, unknown soldier. Many of you know how difficult the first years of this struggle were. The way from a small movement of 7 men to the taking over of responsible government on January 30th, 1933 was so miraculous that Providence itself must have made it possible through its blessings. Today, I head the strongest army in the world, the mightiest air force, and a proud navy. Behind me, I am conscious of the sworn community of the party which made me great and which became great through me. The enemies that I confront have been known to be our enemies for over 20 years. Alas, the road that lies ahead of me cannot be compared to the one lying behind me. The German Volk realizes the decisiveness of the hour for its existence. Under the most difficult circumstances, millions of soldiers are obediently and loyally doing their duty. Peasants, workers, German women and girls work by the sweat of their brows in the factories and offices, in the fields and in farmland, to secure bread for the homeland and weapons for the front. The strong people allied to us suffer the same misery and face the same enemies. The American president and his plutocratic clique have called us a people of have-nots. That is right, and these have-nots want to live. In any event, they will not allow the owners to rob them of the little that they have to live on. My party comrades, you know my relentless resolve to conclude a struggle victoriously once it has begun. You know my intention not to shy away from anything in such a fight and to break all the resistance that has to be broken. In my speech on September 1st, 1939, I assured you that in this struggle, neither the force of arms nor time will defeat Germany. I want to assure my enemies that neither will the force of arms nor time defeat us, but neither inner doubts make us falter in the fulfillment of our duty. When we consider the sacrifices of our soldiers, how they risk their lives, then the sacrifices of the homeland become completely insignificant and unimportant. When we think of the numbers of those who, generations before us, fell for the existence and greatness of the German Volk, then we become all the more aware of the greatness of the duty imposed on us. Whoever seeks to forsake this duty has no right to expect treatment as a Volksgenosse in our midst. Just as we were mercilessly harsh in our struggle for power, we will be merciless and harsh in our struggle for the preservation of our Volk. Thousands of our best men will fall in its course, the fathers and the sons of our Volk. Therefore, no one can expect to live who thinks that he can depreciate the front sacrifices at home. Irrespective of the form of disguise for this attempt to disrupt this German front, to undermine this Volk's willingness to resist, to weaken the authority of this regime, to sabotage the efforts of the homeland, the offender will fall. There will be only one difference. The soldier honorably makes this sacrifice at the front, while the other, who wishes to depreciate this honorable sacrifice, dies in shame. Our enemies should not deceive themselves. In the 2,000 years of the history known to us, our German Volk has never been more unified and united than it is today. The Lord of the worlds has done so many great things for us in the last years that we bow in gratitude before Providence, which has permitted us to be members of such a great folk. We thank him that in view of past and future generations of the German folk, we were also allowed to enter our names honorably in the undying book of German history.